You know that weird feeling when you walk into a room, hear a song from the 80s or 90s, and suddenly your entire childhood downloads into your brain like an old school dial-up connection. If you're Gen X, your mind does that a lot. You're the generation that grew up with rotary phones and smartphones, mixtapes and Spotify, analog childhoods and digital adulthoods. One foot in a world where you had to rewind VHS tapes, and another in a world where you can stream anything, anytime. And somewhere between all of that, your psychology, how you think, feel, cope, and relate cut, shaped in a way that's very specific, very complex, and honestly, pretty fascinating. So let me show you what's actually going on in the Gen X mind. Because you're not just the middle child between boomers and millennials. You're not just the forgotten generation or the punchline about loving grunge and sarcasm. There's a deeper story your brain has been quietly telling for decades. Let's start with something simple. Picture this. You, Ray, maybe some Bilan or X, your parents are at work. You come home after school. You unlock the door, drop your backpack, maybe grab a snack, turn on the TV, and that's it, you're on your own for a few hours. No text check-ins, no location tracking, no share your live location ping. Just you, the TV, maybe a sibling, and a vague expectation that you should not burn the house down. That's the latchkey kid stereotype. But it's also an actual psychological environment. Researchers talk about something called autonomous supportive environments. Settings where kids are given responsibility, freedom, and the expectation that they can handle themselves. Gen X was marinated in that. Sometimes it was empowering, sometimes it was neglect. Often, it was both at once. So you grew up in this space where you learned, early, I handle things myself. Your nervous system got used to being the backup plan. It's not surprising that a lot of Gen X struggles to ask for help, even when they are drowning. It's not that you're incapable of receiving support. It's that your default script says, I got it. I'll figure it out. I always do. You may even feel a quiet shame when you don't. But here's the twist. That same pattern also built a psychological superpower. What psychologists sometimes call self-efficacy. It's the belief that you can affect your world, that you can figure stuff out, fix a situation, survive change. Gen X has this in spades. When the world hits chaos, you might complain, you might roll your eyes, you might mutter something sarcastic, but then you just start. You troubleshoot, you tinker, you make it work. If you ever found yourself teaching your parents how to use a VCR and then years later teaching your kids how to use a computer, that's not just a family joke. That's your brain acting as a bridge again. And that bridge role, that's a big piece of the Gen X psyche. Imagine being a translator stuck between two languages all the time. On one side, boomers and older silent generation parents, with landlines hierarchy, because I said so, and a culture that didn't really talk about feelings unless it was a big problem. On the other side, millennials and Gen Z, raised in a more emotionally aware language, mental health boundaries, check in with your feelings, therapy talk on tech, Slack messages about burnout. Gen X sits right in the middle. You probably learned to read facial expressions and tones long before anyone said the words emotional intelligence to you. You knew when dad was stressed without him saying a thing. You knew when mom was upset, even if she said, I'm fine. You navigated divorce rates soaring, economic recessions, the rise of cable news, the threat of nuclear war, and the quiet, weird hum of something's not right, but we don't talk about it. Psychologists sometimes describe this as growing up in a high ambiguity, low guidance environment. The rules were changing, but no one handed you a manual, so you wrote your own. That's one reason Gen X is often called cynical, but that word doesn't quite fit. It's not raw cynicism, it's more like defensive realism. You learned not to fully trust institutions. You watched politicians lie, corporations merge and collapse, savings vanish, jobs disappear. You saw scandals, crises, and broken promises play out on TV in real time. You watched the world say, we've got this under control, while your brain quietly went, yeah, I'll believe it when I see it. Underneath that skepticism is something beautifully human. A need for authenticity. You don't necessarily need everything to be perfect. You just want it to be real. No spin, no sugarcoat, no weary, family corporate nonsense. Well, they cut staff. That's why Gen X humor can be so dark and so comforting. Sarcasm, self-deprecation, a well-placed eye roll, those are not just jokes. They're psychological armor. A way of saying, I see the absurdity, and I'm not pretending it's fine. but I'm still here, and I'm still going to work tomorrow. Now, let's talk about something you probably feel, even if you haven't named it. You've spent a lot of your life holding tension. You held the tension between analog and digital, between go outside and don't come back until dinner and text me when you get there, between keep your private life private and share everything online. Your brain had to adapt over and over again. You went from payphones to pagers to flip phones to smartphones. From record stores to Napster to iTunes to streaming. That's not just nostalgia. That's cognitive load, constant adaptation, neuroplasticity in action. And there's research on this. Studies on midlife generations show that those who experience rapid technological and cultural shifts can develop strong cognitive flexibility, an ability to hold multiple perspectives, switch between tasks, adapt to new rules. At the same time, they often carry a low-level fatigue, a sense of, can the world just stop updating for 5 minutes? So when you hear some new app's name and your first thought is, I do not have the bandwidth for that, that's not laziness. That's a brain that's been onboarding new systems since the Atari days. Now consider where many Gen Xers are in life right now. You might be in your 40s or 50s. You might have kids, or aging parents, or both. You might be middle management at work, and middle everything at home. You're the emotional tech support, the actual tech support, the planner, the fixer, the one who remembers who likes what on holidays. There's a psychological term called role strain. It happens when you're juggling multiple roles at once, and each one expects a lot from you. Gen X is almost a case study in collective role strain. You're the generation that shows up, even when you're exhausted, even when your own needs were never really modeled for you. You probably grew up seeing adults push through, numb out, drink, work, cope, but rarely say, I need help, or I'm overwhelmed, or I'm not okay. So now, when you feel those things, your inner script might say, don't be dramatic, just get on with it. You minimize your own struggles because that's what you watched. Here's where the reframe comes in. What if that quiet, heavy sense of I'll just deal with it is not weakness or emotional flatness, but an adaptive strategy, a survival skill built by a brain that had to grow up quickly? And what if the next step isn't to throw that skill away, but to evolve it? Think about it like this. When you were a kid, you probably had a favorite mixtape or burned CD. It had songs you recorded off the radio. Maybe cuts that weren't perfectly timed, but that tape got you through some serious moments: heartbreak, late nights, long bus rides. Your Gen X coping strategies are like that mixtape. They weren't always curated. Some of the tracks were recorded in chaos, but they got you through. Now you have access to better tools, more knowledge, more language about mental health, trauma, boundaries, burnout. You don't have to keep listening to the same 12 tracks forever. You can add new songs, new strategies, without hating the old ones. For example, your independence, the I'll do it myself reflex helped you survive. It also occasionally isolates you, but independence can evolve into interdependence. Choosing when to be strong, alone, and when to share the load. That's not betrayal of your identity. It's an upgrade. Your skepticism protected you from being naive. It can evolve into discernment, the ability to see through nonsense while still allowing yourself to believe in people, in ideas, in change without rolling your eyes at your own hope. Your humor, especially the dark, dry, observational kind, has been a pressure valve. It kept you from being crushed by the weight of everything. That can evolve into conscious self-compassion, laughing not at your pain, but with yourself, gently, as you heal it. There's another layer here that doesn't get talked about enough. Grief. Many Gen Xers are carrying a quiet grief that's hard to name. It's grief for a kind of childhood freedom that no longer exists. Grief for lost parents, lost marriages, lost careers. Grief for the version of adulthood you were promised that never fully materialized: stable jobs, pensions, affordable housing, work hard and it'll all work out. Psychology tells us that unrecognized grief can disguise itself as irritability, numbness, or low-grade cynicism. That feeling of, what's the point, that you joke about. It might actually be sadness that was never given a name or a place to land. But here's the hopeful part. Gen X is uniquely positioned to heal that grief in a way no previous generation could. You have the emotional literacy that your parents' generation often lacked, and the lived experience that younger generations haven't hit yet. You can look at your life and say, yes, a lot was unfair. Yes, I had to grow up fast, but I get to decide what I pass on. You don't have to repeat the emotional silence you grew up with. You can sit with your kid, or your younger coworker, or your own inner child, and say, it's okay to be tired. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay not to be the strong one all the time. That act, right there, is psychological rebellion, quiet but radical. There's also something else about Gen X minds that shows up a lot. Loyalty. You bonded to your bands, your shows, your movies, your friends, your tiny subcultures. You had fewer choices back then, so the ones you made. They dug deep. You didn't just like a band. You lived in their lyrics. You didn't just watch a movie. You memorized half the lines. Psychologists might call that identity anchoring, using specific cultural pieces to hold your sense of self in a chaotic world. Today, when everything is hyper-personalized, hyper-algorithmic, and constantly shifting, those anchors still matter. Sometimes, when you replay that old song or rewatch that show, your brain isn't just chasing nostalgia. It's checking in with a younger version of you, asking, am I still me? Did I lose myself somewhere? And the answer, when the chorus hits, is usually, no. I'm still in here. You've changed, but your core values, freedom, authenticity, self-reliance with a side of, don't BS me, they're intact. So where does this leave you? In a strange, powerful middle space. Old enough to remember life before the internet, young enough to keep evolving with it, experienced enough to see patterns, flexible enough to still change them. If you've ever caught yourself thinking, is it too late for me to grow, to heal, to start over? Here's what the research says. The brain remains plastic your whole life. People in their 40s, 50s, even 60s, routinely make massive changes in their habits, careers, relationships. The idea that your personality is set at 30 is outdated science. You're not a finished product. You're a work in progress with excellent backstory. So maybe the real psychology of Gen X is this. You are a generation trained, through chaos and contradiction, to live in between eras, between expectations, between realities. And in that in-between, you learned resilience, skepticism, creativity, and a quiet kind of grit. The invitation now is to add one more layer: softness. Softness with yourself when you're tired. Softness with your younger self, who had to toughen up too quickly. Softness with the part of you that still feels like the responsible one. Walking into the empty house after school, telling yourself you're fine, even when you weren't. You can keep your edge. You can keep your humor, your eye rolls, your playlists, your I'm not impressed face. Just don't turn that sharpness inward like a weapon. Turn it outward, where it belongs, toward systems that fail people, toward nonsense, toward hypocrisy. And let your inner world be a little kinder, a little more forgiving. Because the truth is, the world has leaned on Gen X for a long time, as the adapters, the translators, the quiet stabilizers. And you've done that. You've been that. Now you get to ask a different question. What do I actually want my mind to feel like for the rest of my life? If this exploration made something in you nod, or stirred a memory, or gave you words for something you've felt for years, sit with that for a moment. Maybe even share it with another Gen Xer, with someone younger trying to understand you, or just with the part of yourself that's been waiting to be seen. And if you want to keep unpacking what's going on in your mind, your generation, your story, your pattern, stick around, subscribe, leave a comment about your own Gen X moments, the latchkey afternoons, the mixtapes, the ways you learned to be strong. Your story isn't in the background of history. It's right here, unfolding, and your mind is still very much in the making.